welcome to Theoretical Advances and Problems in the Sociology of Punishment. I'm very excited that we have tonight Professor David Garland from New York University addressing us tonight. So this is really very exciting for both the Sydney Law School and the Sydney Institute of Criminology. My name's Carolyn Mackay. I'm one of the directors of the Sydney Institute of Criminology, along with my colleague, Dr. Andrew Dyer. And certainly the Institute welcomes you all and certainly welcomes Professor Garland as visiting scholar with the Institute and all the law school. Also welcome to Anne for coming along tonight too. Before we begin the proceedings, I'd like to acknowledge and pay respect to the traditional owners of the land on which we meet, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. Of course, it is upon their ancestral lands that the University of Sydney has been built. So tonight, as we share our knowledge, teaching, our research practices within this university, may we all respects to the knowledge embedded forever within the Aboriginal custodianship of country. I think it's particularly important to recognise that given the topic of tonight's presentation and the figures that have come out just recently about the extremely high levels of incarceration within Australia and the overrepresentation of First Nations people in our Australian prisons. As I said, it's very exciting to be able to chair and introduce to chair this session and introduce David Garland tonight to you. Actually, just before I do that, I just want to let you know that Professor Garland will talk for approximately 70 minutes, give or take. We'll have time for some Q&A from the audience here. And then I hope you'll all join us for some cocktails afterwards from 7:30. So I hope you can all stay around for that as well. As I said, the talk tonight is Theoretical Advances and Problems in the Sociology of Punishment. So this seminar is being delivered by Sydney Law School visiting fellow, Professor David Garland from New York University, and it explores the theoretical advances and problems in the sociology of punishment. I'll just tell you a little bit about Professor Garland, although I'm sure most of you are very, very well aware of his background. So David Garland is Arthur T. Vanderbilt Professor of Law and Professor of Sociology at New York University. His distinguished body of work includes Punishment and Welfare, a history of penal strategies, Punishment and Modern Society, a study in social theory, the culture of control, crime and social order in contemporary society, Peculiar Institution, America's death penalty in an age of abolition, and the welfare state, a very short introduction. His many honours include membership of the British Academy, the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and the Royal Society of Edinburgh. And he's also the recipient of the American Society of Criminology's Edwin H. Sutherland Prize for outstanding contributions to theory and research. He's currently working on a book entitled Roots of Injustice, The Structural Sources of America's Penal State. About this particular presentation, so the last 20 years has seen a remarkable increase in punishment and society scholarship. Together with this quantitative expansion, there has also been important qualitative developments in research, analysis, and explanation, many of which can be counted as scientific advances. In this talk tonight, Professor Garland will describe a number of dimensions along which theory, method, and data in this field have been improved. And also, he will also identify a number of continuing challenges and problems. Examples from the American literature on the emergence of mass incarceration and the nature of the so-called war on drugs are used to indicate the range of theoretical resources that scholars in the field have developed and to point to empirical and theoretical questions that remain to be resolved. It's very exciting to introduce you, and please join me in welcoming Professor David Garland. Thank you.
So thank you very much indeed, Garland. That was a lovely introduction. It's a great, great pleasure to be here in Sydney Law School, and this campus is beautiful. I was in Australia briefly once before, about 30 years ago, and I have two abiding memories. One is being asleep for days at a time, and the other was like the law school being nowhere near any campus. And so this is just a transformation in terms of like what it means to be here and to be visiting. Anne and I were strolling around the campus before. It's just gorgeous. So my subject this evening is, as Carolyn was saying, the sociology of punishment, or punishment in society as it's sometimes called. I want to talk about its character, its development, and some of its current problems. I'm aware that there are probably several people in the audience this evening who have made contributions to the field, who are experts, but there's also, I'm sure, a few of you who don't know anything about it. So let me begin by giving a kind of brief introduction or overview to the field. Then I'll talk about how it's changed, what kind of theoretical challenges still remain, and what kind of problems I think are there. So I'm giving one of the features that was clear in Carolyn's introduction is I've been around a long time, and one of the things that makes possible is that the field I'm describing, which is mostly developed over the last 40 years, I've pretty much been present in for all of that time. So I have a kind of view of it, which I'll try and share with you, but I'm also very conscious that my view is a positioned one, right? It's shaped by my institutional location and time and space, by my interests, my experience, my politics. No doubt the field looks very different to those of you who view it from this particular part of the globe, or from a younger generation, or with different intellectual commitments and interests and so on. So I hope at the end of the talk, the themes that you would rather have been discussing will come up, and you'll ask about them, we'll discuss them. And also that some of the theoretical assumptions I'm making as I describe this field might be contested or argued about or debated. So let me describe what the sociology of punishment is and how it emerged. So sociological studies of punishment of one kind and another have been around a long time, certainly since the 1890s, when the French sociologist Émile Durkheim theorized about punishment and its role in social order. Even earlier, if we think about de Tocqueville or Montesquieu before them. But as an organized field, the sociology of punishment is really no more than 40 years old. There's been a remarkable migration of scholars, particularly young scholars, into that field during that time. And it's become, I think, one of the most lively and dynamic areas of the social sciences. Now, that migration of scholars into the field is partly being attracted by the kind of research possibilities, by interesting new questions, by the kind of intellectual possibilities of the field, but also, and I think this is quite important, a reason for getting involved in sociology of punishment has been the real world events that have been occurring over the last 40 years, particularly the way in which in many Western nations, one after the other, law and order politics, mass incarceration, death penalties, police violence, systemic racism and criminal justice have kind of moved to the forefront of political and social consciousness. And that, of course, has attracted many people to the field, given it much of its energy and vitality. I think, though, that it's also shaped the field in a particular way, and perhaps operates a kind of intellectual constraint on what gets said in the field. So I'm going to talk about that a little later, but I kind of mention that to you now as I go ahead. So prior to the emergence of this new field, which I'm going to be describing, the standard frameworks for studying punishment were penology, or criminal justice studies, as it's called in the USA, and also the philosophy of punishment, both of which are rather different in scope and character from the field I'm going to describe. Penology viewed punishment as a mode primarily of offender management and crime control. Penological research was primarily a knowledge for the improvement of penal practices, a kind of penitentiary science, as it was called in the 19th century. Penology was generally reformist and mildly critical. Mostly penologists were pushing for more rehabilitation, correctionalism and welfare, less retribution and deterrence. But by and large, it operated, and still does, as kind of the research and development arm of the penal state. Its primary concern is to reduce crime, and especially recidivism. Its primary question is, what works? The philosophy of punishment, a rather more distinguished tradition intellectually, approaches punishment as a moral problem. It asks, when is punishment justified? What is a just punishment? Now, of course, these are vital questions, but until recently, philosophers tended to approach them in a way that was rather idealized, rather empirically ungrounded, and in a way that was always framed by a liberal rubric, where a legitimate state, a rule of law state, was faced by a law-breaking offender, a law-breaking individual, and the question was, under what circumstances, to what extent can this be punishment? Actually, Nikki Lacey, who was, I think, a presence here in some ways, she approached the question of the philosophy of punishment from a communitarian approach, which was really rather different kind of shaking up of the issues and transformations. But by and large, philosophy of punishment is operated in a liberal rubric. As a consequence, and for the most part, philosophy of punishment got very little to say about the actual techniques and practices of punishment and their normative status. It's got nothing to say about the proper extent and scale of punishment, or about the wider social consequences of how we punish. The result is a somewhat, and using it in a pejorative term for one's academic discourse, that had little real purchase when it came to penal policy or even evaluating particular practices of punishment. Now, I'd like to say, actually, I forgot to put a slide up to this effect, but in 1994, a philosopher, Anthony Duff, and myself put together a collection, a reader on punishment, for Oxford University Press, which tried to kind of challenge that empirically ungrounded, idealized account. And indeed, Anthony Duff has gone on in the years since to become, I think, one of the most exemplary exponents of a non-idealist philosophy of punishment. So he's a kind of special exception to the kind of generalizations I'm making just now. But in any case, the point I want to make is that the sociology of punishment set itself up as an alternative framework which differs from these predecessors, from penology and from philosophy of punishment. It's more detached from the system than penology, studying punishment from the outside, sociologically, historically, comparatively. And I think it's more reality congruent than the philosophy of punishment, more critical about the nature of the state, more inclined to delay normative judgments until such time as the particular practices of punishment have been specified more precisely. So as this new field of analysis, this new framework about punishment took shape, the exponents of it kind of carved out or identified a slightly different object of study. Instead of talking about punishment or the penal system, primarily they talked about penality. And penality refers, this is really like a French term Emile Durkheim used, just anglified. Penality refers to the totality of the state's penal apparatus, to its laws and sanctions and institutions, its technologies, its knowledges, its powers, but also its discourses, representations and symbols and rituals. So rather than thinking about punishment narrowly as a relationship between a state and an individual that may or may not be justified, or thinking about it as being the penal system and what the penal system does internally with offenders and their management, it's really about how penal practices, penal powers, penal symbols permeate out into the social world and produce an effectiveness, consequences there that go beyond crime control and beyond the management of offenders. So a distinctive set of questions, really genealogical questions, how do specific penal measures come into existence? Functional questions, how do penal institutions contribute to social order or to state power or class domination? And the kind of concerns that the field has are described there, basically to specify in general relations between forms of punishment and forms of society, thinking about how structures of social action and webs of cultural meaning give shape to specific punishments and their functions and forms and effects. And finally, tracing out the social causes and consequences of specific penal modes. For example, there's a book I edited 20 years ago called Mass Incarceration, Mass Imprisonment, Social Causes and Consequences. And that kind of defines, I think, the generality of concern of people in this area. Now, obviously, I think a framework of that kind is not totally at odds with penology, the same subject matter, an empirical social scientific approach, makes extensive use, obviously, of penological materials. But the real difference is one of analytical scope and ambition. So whereas penology situated itself within penal institutions and seeks to understand their penological functioning, the sociology of punishment views these institutions largely from the outside, as it were, and tries to understand their functioning, not just penological functioning, but how it is that these institutions and practices and symbols and representations contribute to the creation of social organization and social order, or indeed the disruption of social organization and social order. So the questions are different, even if some of the materials are the same. And importantly, the sociological approach doesn't deny for a moment that penal institutions are, to a great extent, oriented towards the management of offenders and towards crime control. But what it does deny is that punishment can be wholly understood in terms of these objectives. Why is that? Well, because no social artifact can be understood that way. Basically, penal institutions have got an instrumental purpose, but they also have a cultural style, a politics, and a social meaning that shape how that objective is pursued. And of course, comparative work, historical work, shows that the same general objective, crime control, offender management, prevention of recidivism, reduction of danger, that these objectives have been pursued in all sorts of different ways over time, and all sorts of different ways across jurisdictions and cultural spaces. The point's obvious, really. We build shelter, we wear clothes to protect us from the elements, but nobody thinks that architecture or fashion can be adequately explained by reference to the basic function. In the same way, penal systems treat lawbreakers, do justice, control crime, but they always do so in ways that are mediated by social conventions, economic resources, institutional dynamics, and political forces. And it's that interaction between the penal and the social that punishment in society, sociology of punishment, attempts to explain. So that's the field and its ambition. And it really began, I think, in earnest and in organized ways some 30 or 40 years ago. But of course, it has a prehistory. And a number of, I think, classic and continually important analyses formed the foundation for that field that was built in the last generation or so. So most obviously the work of Emile Durkheim beginning in the 1890s. Emile Durkheim interpreted punishment as a morality affirming, solidarity producing ritual performance that was driven by the passionate energies of collective sentiment. He also, I should say, in this book, Division of Labor, in Moral Education, he also, I think, highlighted, although this wasn't his purpose, highlighted the cultural aspects of punishment, the way in which its symbols and representations and rituals shaped identity, shaped solidarity, shaped sensibilities. And quite recently, a sociologist at Yale, Philip Smith, who has spent a lot of time in Australia, actually, he really took up Durkheim's ideas, developed them, a kind of neo-Durkheimian style, and developed this beautiful book, Punishment and Culture, which is all about thinking punishment as a cultural practice and asking the question about what it means, how its meanings change, how its meanings get deformed over time, how it's constantly kind of developing in a pure form that's then polluted, tainted, difficulty. And the analyses that are Durkheimian, but they're extremely interesting. I recommend the book to you enthusiastically. A second tradition was a Marxist one. So Marx himself wrote nothing about crime or punishment, nothing very serious in any case. However, there were a number of scholars, Ruschen Kirkheimer from the Frankfurt School, Douglas Hay, writing in the 1970s in Warwick with E.P. Thompson, and Dario Meloso and Massimo Pavarini in Italy. All of these scholars really developed a kind of Marxist framing of the question of punishment, and that they conceptualized the penal system as a state apparatus that in various ways plays an important economic and ideological and political role, either in propping up the labor market, that was pretty much Ruschen Kirkheimer's idea, or disciplining workers, or enhancing legitimacy of the ruling class. That was very much the Douglas Hay account of Albion's fatal tree. The third, probably the best known prefigurative account that preceded the sociology of punishment, which became a really important part of it, is Michel Foucault's work, Discipline and Punish, first published in 1975, translated into English in 1977. This book, which many of you will know, doesn't so much view punishment from the outside as the others did, but rather goes into the inner workings of the carceral machinery and conceptualizes the way we punish as so many technologies of power and knowledge, apparatuses of normalization, surveillance, regulation, discipline, which he details in really precise, concrete specificity. And then he links them to broader networks of regulation through which he says modern individuals are governed. So for Durkheim, for the Marxists, for Foucault, punishment is to be studied, but not for its own sake, but rather because it reflects and throws light on larger social processes, processes of social organization and solidarity, processes of labor management and class struggle, processes of governing the individual and constituting who we are. So in all these ways, punishment is the topic, but it's really not the purpose of the undertaking. Yes, power knowledge. I should say actually that the Foucauldian analyses were really translated into the world of criminology very effectively by Stan Cohen, whose work on classification, whose work on community corrections was really an important bridge between the philosophy of Foucault and the criminology of many of us. Two other sources worth mentioning. One is the work of Norbert Elias. Norbert Elias, the kind of remarkable social theorist, historian, best known for his work on the civilizing process. His work had nothing much to say about punishment, but it had clear implications for thinking about the history of punishment. His work was very much about our relationship to violence, our relationship to the body, our relationship to each other, and the way that over time that relationship is transformed at the level of violence, at the level of the state, but also in our sensibilities, in our affect, in our kind of habitus, how we feel about disgusting things, particularly how we feel about violence. And Peter Sperenberg, the Dutch historian who died actually quite recently, Peter utilized Elias's ideas in a certain form to explain the long-term transformation of how we kill offenders. The transformation of the transformation of the spectrum, executions and the evolution of repression from pre-industrial metropolis to European experience, all developed within an Elysian framework of processes of state formation, processes of interdependence that give rise to new sensibilities, and in the end make it uncomfortable to view, and for the state problematic to engage in the violent corporal and capital punishment of offenders. Now, it's very important because if we think about it, corporal punishment and capital punishment remain very effective means of control and repression. We don't use them. If we use them, we pretend not to use them. Why would that be? And the answer that Elias gives has to do with views of violence that emerge from interdependent forms and state formation. Finally, in terms of the prehistory, there was for a long time in the 1960s a version of social work about prison. It was about the emergence of social forms within the prison, about the emergence of acting collectively themselves. Irving Goffman, Donald Clemmer, Grisham Sykes, James Jacobs, really writing in very rich about how people locked up, isolated, separated, stripped of, able to create social forms, shape a society develop a culture all of their own. So this is, again, was a kind of sociological treatment of punishment, different from philosophy of punishment, different from penology, inspiring in lots of ways for the sociological work that followed. Pat Garland on women's imprisonment, similarly. So one of the things that happened with punishment society or sociology of punishment scholarship is it became established as a field of study, by which I mean it was institutionalized in textbooks, in peer-reviewed journal, Punishment Society Journal, for example, handbooks, the Sage Handbook of Punishment Society, college courses, academic appointments, conference sections. It became normalized in a certain kind of way. And that's kind of, and it has an interesting effect. So young academics, some of them not so young anymore, but people in their 40s and 30s who are producing their first books have typically been trained in graduate school in a field that exists with reference to standard reference points within that field, with regard to methods and theories that are taught in that field. And that's a formative experience that a generation ago simply wasn't available to their supervisors. Supervisors, my generation, were making it up as they were going along. There was no training, there was no formation, there was no normalization. There was instead a whole series of, dots on a map that people were trying to join up and make sense of and render coherent. Now, the effect of that institutionalization and normalization is interesting. On the one hand, the new scholarship is less groundbreaking, less pioneering. I mean, obviously, it can't be pioneering anymore. So in some ways, the questions that are taken on are smaller questions, more focused questions. In some ways, each new study is less revelatory than some of the studies that a generation ago were being done. But at the same time, the new work is much more theoretically sophisticated, much more methodologically careful and controlled, much more impressive in its consistency and its range of contribution. So basically, the work has been normalized and improved. We've shifted from a kind of moment of paradigm shifting to normal science, and that brings with it improvements in the day-to-day work of the people who are in that field. It usually means that every new study is incremental in its effects, but it doesn't mean that every new study tends to be building on an existing body of knowledge and therefore is worthwhile and moving that body knowledge along. And I think that's exactly what's been happening. So what I'm going to do in the time that remains of this evening's lecture, and I do hope for your sake I stop before 70 minutes. 50 minutes seems like the appropriate time if I can manage that, maybe 60 if I go on. But I want to make a number of general observations about the changes that have occurred over that time, about how we've moved from something that was really brand new in 1980 to something that's now kind of established and people who are moving into the field don't even realize it's new in 2022. So a number of observations. First of all, there's been a shift in historical attention. The things that historians in the field, and they've always made a major contribution, things that historians in the field are paying attention to are not the same now as they were then. In the 70s and 80s, the emergence of the modern prison, the modern penitentiary, and indeed modern penality was pretty much the topic of the day. And that was what caused debates, that what the major contributions were around. It was all about the birth of the prison and competing accounts of how to explain the birth of the prison. People thought about the penitentiary as being really an emergent institution in the late 18th, early 19th century. Someone like Peter Sperenberg would argue against that. It's been around for much longer. But the conceit, at least, was that the penitentiary is a product of late 18th century, early 19th century Western society. How come? What explains that? And the Durkheimian account was it's a consequence of modernity in the form of organic solidarity, individualism, the transformation of social relations. The Marxist account was, of course, it's a consequence of capitalism. It's related to the labor market, disciplining of workers. The Foucauldian account is to do with a shift in the nature of power, away from violent militarized power towards a more subtle, extensive, disciplinary, bureaucratic power. The nature of the modern state has changed. And for the Elysians, for Sperenberg, for others, myself included, it was also to do with sensibilities and shifts in cultural relations, shift in cultural meaning, shift particularly in the way that we relate to violence and to each other. Now, one of the important things about all of these studies is that each of them was undertaken with a view to theoretical advance in the field that was developed. So the idea was that one undertook this historical work to contribute towards the theory of ideology, or to contribute towards the understanding of monopoly capitalism, or the civilizing process. Same is true, there's some very interesting work done at that time in the 70s, particularly the early 80s, on the death penalty, particularly death penalty in Europe and even in Britain. People like Douglas Hay, people like Thomas Lacour, people like Peter Sperenberg, they're studying the death penalty in order to contribute to theoretical debates about the nature of ideology, the nature, for example, of the ruling class in 18th century England, and how it is that they managed to maintain their rule and claim legitimacy and authority and majesty through a death penalty, which was more often legislated. There were hundreds, 200 death penalty offenses in the late 18th, early 19th century in the English criminal code, but the death penalty itself was very rarely carried out. Why was this, Douglas Hay asked? And the answer he gave was it had to do with the production of deference and authority, majesty, but at the same time, deference. So why was he studying the death penalty? Not because he was interested in the death penalty, because he was interested in ideology. Same with Sperenberg and civilized sensibilities, same with the Marxists who were studying the prison and the labor market. I think that today, the historical focus has shifted. There are still many historical studies, but most of them, not all of them, there are exceptions. Guy Geltner studied the history of corporal punishment and flogging in a very interesting short book for Amsterdam University Press, where actually it's called Flogging Others. And the key takeaway of his account is that corporal punishment has been regarded from very early on as being the mark of the savage, the barbarian, the uncivilized. And the other people flogging, other nations flogging, other types of people flogging, people before us using corporal punishment, these are nearly always conceits of a subsequent period or a different authority who want to talk about corporal punishment that other people are carrying out and to deny the corporal punishment they themselves are carrying out. So sometimes there are still long-term studies, Geltner's is an example, but most of the historical work that's being done today is being done on very recent developments between the 1970s and today. The emergence of mass incarceration, for example, in the USA has produced countless historical studies in one state after another, one region after another. And the orientation of that historical work is no longer theoretical in large part. It's primarily some kind of political intervention in the present. It's primarily about understanding the roots of contemporary policy in order to undermine or challenge or reverse them. So I think historical work has become more focused, but also less theoretically ambitious in a way, more explicitly political and less decidedly conceptual. Yeah, I didn't show you the slide, but basically these were some of the studies of the development of the modern penitentiary that I'm referring to. And that this is the Goodman, Page, and Phelps book is really a kind of a summing up of contemporary scholarship by the younger generation of punishment society scholars. And the topics that they're dealing with and the focus of the historical work is much more late 20th century, early 21st, much less late 18th, early 19th. A second observation I'd make is this, that when the sociology of punishment got going in the first place, a lot of the work was what I'd describe as descriptive sociology. It was all about classifying and identifying penal trends and patterns. Now, some of the best of that work, like Cohen's, for example, or like Feely and Simons, identified important new patterns and talked about the way in which they were infiltrating or trending or developing. But by and large, it gave rise to a lot of work that was really cataloging what's out there, describing, I don't know, the spread of discipline and normalization, the influence of managerialism, examples of the culture of control, neoliberal penality, examples of governing through crime. Basically, a lot of work was about spotting trends that other people already identified and presenting them as original scholarship. I would say that that kind of work is now much less valued than it was when I was beginning in this field. Basically, a lot of the efforts now, particularly the work that gets published in the top journals, is really much more concerned with interpretive understanding and causal explanation. Not description, but moving beyond description to explanation. And for example, I think this is an exemplary account. Michael Campbell and Heather Schoenfeld, an article in the American Journal of Sociology, which is really, I think, marked the moment when that younger generation of people, Campbell and Schoenfeld, when they were doing this, were just graduate students, really made the move from the kind of ambition of describing what's out there, rationalizing in some kind of way the descriptions, presenting trends, to asking explanatory causal questions and pointing to the actors, the agencies, the interests, the opportunity structures, and developing that as the kind of ambition, not merely description. I think that's really a big advance. Another observation, we've moved, I think, from general theory to middle range theorizing. And I don't think that's a demotion. I think that's a mark of the advance of the field. So 30-odd years ago, 32 years ago, I published this book, Punishment in Modern Society. And an Australian scholar, Adrian Howe, published this a year or two later. And both of these are examples of offering grand social theory as a kind of toolkit for practitioners in the field. The idea was that Durkheim or Marx or Foucault or Elias or Clifford Geertz could, as it were, provide the orientation and provide the conceptual tools for doing work in this area. Now, I think that if a similar book with the same kind of ambitions would be written today, if I were writing this today or someone else would be, I think it would be quite different in its character. I think it'd be much more case and place specific. I think it'd be much more comparative. It'd be much more middle range in its theorizing. That's to say, it'd be focused on particular topics, not punishment as such. We focus on particular development or areas or practices and theorizing them rather than theorizing punishment as such. So for example, today's debates, theoretical debates, are all about the extent to which, I don't know, neoliberal penalty exists or operates. The extent to which the thesis, the new Jim Crow, the idea that American punishment today is really a form of racial ordering undertaken on a colorblind basis. Is that really a good description or not a good description? What about American exceptionalism? Is there indeed such a thing as the exceptional character of American penalty, or indeed of Scandinavian penalty, in such a way that people can theorize and explain and understand? These are the topics that people argue about today. They're much more specific, they're much more focused, they're much more comparative. And so this kind of work, I think, is now in the background. Maybe it's kind of basic or foundational. The questions that people are actively engaging with are at a stage beyond these generalities, much more middle range. I think to that extent, much more productive. I think there have been improvements of theory and method. I think I mentioned this when I was talking before about Campbell and Schoenfeld. I think that there's now much more of an effort to identify specific individual and collective actors, the specific interest and interest formation involved, the incentives, their opportunities that enable their action. I think if you remember reading Foucault or reading Durkheim or Durkheim or even I think Garland, a lot of the time things are happening in the passive voice. Developments are occurring without the specification of particular actors in particular places, thinking particular thoughts with particular motives, particular interests, and opportunities for acting on these reasons. I think the work today is much more engaged at that detailed action level. Now, it doesn't stay there. There's always the effort to relate recurring patterns of action to wider structures and causal mechanisms. But nonetheless, there's a much more kind of focused precision that moves from kind of macro level analysis to the micro processes that produce these macro outcomes. At the same time, some of the the earlier problems, it used to be the case, I think, that a lot of the analysis, whether it's Marxist or Foucauldian or Durkheim, it was kind of functionalist in its form. And functionalist forms tend to be overly general and insufficiently empirical. And there's still work like that. I think the New Jim Crow is like that. I think that Louis Vicon's book, Punishing the Poor, kind of like that. There's a sense that the system requires a punishment of this kind, and the system gets what it needs. Whether that system is white supremacy in the case of the New Jim Crow, or capitalism in the case of Louis Vicon's work. But by and large, I think most of the scholarship today has moved away from that functionalism. And if it talks about functions, as it still does, it takes care to distinguish between intended and unintended effects, between original causes and subsequent functioning, or to distinguish between the various groups and time periods for which a particular practice is functional or dysfunctional, and why. So it's not as if we've given up functional analysis, that's what sociology is much of the time, but we're much more specific in understanding functions for whom, with what kind of dysfunctions, over what time period, against what other kinds of interests. That's, I think, an improvement. In the same way, interpretive accounts that are interested in specifying the meaning of punishment no longer talk about the meaning of punishment. They always talk about meanings in the plural, for specific groups at specific times, and they're aware, and Philip Smith made this point in his book, Punishment and Culture, that meanings are always contested, and meanings drift, and they change. And it's particularly true, this was Smith's point, particularly true for penal innovations that are always presented, I don't know, the latest technology of executing individuals on death row, you know. So we've now invented electric chair, great science, has solved the problem of killing people without hurting them. Or no, that didn't work, what about the gas chamber? Well, that's been spoiled. What about the lethal injection? Surely that's now the kind of, you know, exemplary form of taking life without touching the body, never imposing violence. Well, it didn't take long for the anesthesiologists to get involved and tell us that lethal injections, particularly as practiced by the death squads of America's prisons, tend to be excruciatingly painful. It's just that we disguise that pain by paralyzing the offender as he's being killed, and in that way disguise the punishment and its corporality from ourselves. So each new pure punishment is pretty quickly polluted. Each new meaning of the official punishment is pretty quickly challenged and undermined and tainted. And that kind of process makes us always pause before we talk about the meaning of any punishment, precisely because of its plurality and its conflict. Another major change, and I think of this as being partly the Americanization of the field, another major change is the extent to which scholars with advanced, highly developed quantitative skills, utilizing sophisticated statistical techniques and utilizing large-scale data sets, or producing large-scale data sets, have moved into the area and are producing work as a consequence. And the effect of that is like twofold. One is that it provides us with much more precise, much more controlled, much more specified accounts of what had previously been rather impressionistic surmises that theorists, I count myself amongst them, had been making. I think the kind of gold standard here is Bruce Weston's work, and I think this book from 2008, 2009, Punishment and Inequality in the USA, in America, really signified the kind of movement of seriously quantitative sociologists into the punishment society field. Now, we know as a consequence much more about the lifetime effect of imprisonment on offenders, their earning power, their families. We know much more about the effect of criminal records on life course events like marriage or family formation, employment, health, and so on. But we also have new theorizations that flow from this quantitative work. It's not as if they're just number crunchers and they're giving some detail of what the theorists have developed. They're also seeing new things and theorizing things differently as a consequence of quantification. So, for example, Weston's work, not this particular one, but work he did with Catherine Becker, showed the labor market consequences of mass incarceration, and did so in a very interesting way. So Bruce had previously in an earlier life been a labour market economist, or a sociologist of the economy, and particularly the labour market. And one of the things that he was interested in, he's Australian by the way, many of you might know Western. I think his father was quite a well-known professor in this country too. Anyway, Bruce had been a labour market economist, and he was very interested in the debate between American neoliberals and European social democrats. And the debate went something like the following, that the purpose of free market neoliberal like regulation of the labour market is job creation. And the proof is that over time America has lower levels of unemployment than do social democratic states in the European Union. And one of the things that Bruce showed is that comparison, unemployment rates in the USA, unemployment rates in Europe, left out of account the extraordinary level of incarceration of prime age working men in the USA. And he calculated that if the US had been incarcerating at the same rate that the average European nation was incarcerating, then the unemployment level in the USA would be 2% higher every year than it's currently stated to be. And all of the differences achieved by neoliberal-like regulations for producing jobs disappear. So this is a way of thinking about the penal system as a labour market institution that nobody really had a handle on previously. There was the idea, Richard Durkheim had the idea previously, that somehow or other threatening people with prison would make them take jobs that they wouldn't otherwise take, and therefore you were kind of managing the law in the labour market by penal means. But the notion that the prison is absorbing surplus labour to a massive extent in a way that is just steadily removing from the government's economic statistics a huge population, typically poor black young men, was I think an insight that would never have occurred but for quantification and scholars like Bruce. And another development actually came from quantification too. Jeff Manzer, a colleague of mine at NYU, and Chris Ugan at Minnesota, they became interested in felon disenfranchisement. The fact that if you were locked up in the USA, sometimes while you're locked up, often even for years and lifetime after you've been locked up, you lose your vote. True in every state other than Maine and Vermont in terms of when you're inside. True of many states. After you've been released, if you have a felony record, you have no vote. And one of the things that became clear in 2000 in Florida was that had Florida state not been a disenfranchising state, then many people in prison or released from prison with a felony record would have voted, and although that particular demographic doesn't vote very often, enough of them would have voted and voted Democrat that the outcome of the presidential election would have just been entirely different. In Florida, despite the hanging chads, despite all the kind of questions about the ballot papers and so on. So this was really an interesting study done by political scientists who moved into the penal field, not because of an intrinsic interest in punishment, but because at one point, a penal measure, namely the disenfranchisement of felons, had massive political consequences that we're still living in. I mean, basically, without Gore versus Bush, Florida, there would be no Iraq War. Without the Iraq War, there'd be no decimation of the Labour Party in Britain, Democrats in the US. I mean, it's all sort of different if you play it out. And that was a consequence of a penal practice that up until that time had hardly been on the radar of anybody. It turns out that since this book, and since the kind of Florida revelation, many states have now witnessed the emergence of anti-disenfranchisement movements. And in many states now, prisoners, former prisoners, people with a felony record are being returned to the ballot, are being re-enfranchised, which is kind of a consequence of this event and this work. Okay, another observation, increased specificity. So, the earliest contributions to the field, the groundbreaking, pioneering, but still kind of broad brush work that was done in the 1980s and 90s, was often talking about developments of, British punishment. A book I wrote about punishment and welfare in 1985 was about British punishment. about American punishment, a book I wrote in 2001, Culture of Control, was about American punishment and British punishment. Much of that kind of bird's eye, 30,000 feet analysis turns out to be persuasive enough first time round, but once scholars begin to analyze in detail at the local level, regional work, state work, local work, it turns out the story is always much more complicated, and much more complicated sometimes in interesting ways that lead to serious revisions of the prior understanding. And this is really what's happened. Nobody now does the history of American punishment or the history of American crime control. They do specific state studies or local studies, often comparative. And what they find is that these regional studies really matter. So for example, Mona Lynch did a study on Arizona and Sunbelt justice, basically looked at the way that the Arizona state authorities developed their Department of Corrections, their prisons, their punishment system. And it turned out that all the assumptions that people made based on California and the Northeast, which were always the kind of prominent parts of the USA that were involved in reformative, correctional, rehabilitative penology, that none of these ever emerged in the Arizona setting. That rehabilitative ideas, correctionist ideas never caught on there. What punishment was about in Arizona, like in Texas, like in New Mexico, like the Southwest, the Sun Belt more generally, not to mention the states of the far South, the Deep South, was always about cheap and mean punishments, minimizing expenditure, minimizing tax expenditure on the development of institutions, utilizing plantations, utilizing farm work, minimizing the provision of qualified trained staff, very little in the way of provision of welfare or medicine or even work in prisons. Often work was outsourced to private contractors and so on. So the USA suddenly no longer looks like New York and California and progressive penology. It looks like many different kinds of places. And that's kind of interesting. But even more interesting when one realizes that over the period between 1960, 70, and 1990, 2000, the migration of population into the South and into the Sun Belt is followed by a shift of political power because the census, the enumeration, the House of Representatives, the Electoral College, all these things southernize national politics in the USA. It becomes more like Texas, more like Arizona, and less like New York, and less like Ohio. And with the southernization of American politics, you also get the southernization of American punishment. The shift away from correctionism, rehabilitation, and expenditure, and towards cheap and mean, stripped down, retributive, deterrent punishment. So, learning about regions and learning about states also illuminates the national story by modifying and moderating and showing a kind of mechanism that people hadn't even seen before when they were looking purely at the federal level and the big picture. So, the more recent work is more specific, more local, more detailed. That by itself is not a great thing. I mean, complexity isn't a virtue in sociology. Sociologists are not trying to explain everything that happened. They're trying to explain what happens and how it happens on a recurring basis. They're trying to seek complexity and then tame it to understand it. So, finding the local, finding the different, finding this state's not the same as the other state, that by itself is not a big achievement. It becomes an achievement when you rework that finding into the larger narrative, larger theorization. And that's precisely what younger scholars are doing. They're building on state studies and then theorizing from them, rather than looking from the top down and assuming it's all the same. And I think that's really a big advance. Single cases to comparisons. That's another development that's important. Sociology of punishment really grew out of critical penology. And penology, by and large, because it's interested in institutions that can be reformed and improved, tends to be local, tends to be specific to a particular jurisdiction, and interested in understanding how it's operating. Sociology of punishment, on the other hand, requires comparisons and controls. And today, I think most of the studies that are undertaken by younger scholars are comparative, at least in terms of having at least a second or a third control case, whereby the mechanisms and processes you think are operative in this particular place can be seen differently operating or not operating at all in a comparable one. So, I don't know, work like Vanessa Barker's, 3 different states in the USA, or Mona Lynch, 2 different prosecution systems, or Lynn Haney's 2 different prisons in California, always now multiple cases, always now comparative. And in addition, there is the emergence, although I think we're still at the very early stages, kind of pioneering baby steps, big ideas and big claims that are not clearly empirically specified. We're beginning to have a comparative penology too, an effort to look at a range of jurisdictions, European, American, Australasian, in ways that try to develop comparative accounts that might explain why the outliers like the USA or the Nordic countries are outliers, and what it is that tends to shape penal systems, practices penality in different places, and how that differs from one jurisdiction to another. The most interesting work, Nikki Lacey, I mentioned before, is doing some interesting work of that kind with her husband, David Soskus. But there's an extremely interesting set of materials being compiled by, I'd like to say, a former student of mine, Adina Usmani and John Clegg. Adina Usmani, who is at Harvard, John Clegg, who's moving to Sydney, the Department of Political Economy, very soon. Together, they've been developing a massive data set about policing and incarceration around the world, and trying to kind of develop large-scale, patterned analyses that will allow comparative work of a serious kind to proceed. I think that will be the future of comparative work of this kind. Up until now, we've had it, but it's often been, well, you know, colleagues and friends of mine do this all the time. Well, basically, you know, America's terrible, but Netherlands looks great, or Norway looks great. What are they doing that we could do? What are the risk factors or the preventative factors that stop us becoming punitive? That kind of work is undertaken really for policy purposes, and it tends to be really tendentious, I think, and really sort of shaped not by a sense of trying to understand processes, but really trying to utilize one system to criticize another, maybe to borrow from that system to improve another. That's really not comparative work. That's policy borrowing by reformist scholars, which is fine and important, and that's how policy works. It's just not the same as sociology. Okay, the last point I want to make has to do with really an issue that's become quite controversial, about which I have a view, which I want to mention. And it's about the autonomy of penal processes, or the lack thereof. So, a recurring theme in the punishment society literature concerns the extent to which penal policies and penal policy choices and penal policy developments do or do not relate to crime trends in these societies. So, a thesis is, and I'll mention in a moment the development of the thesis, a thesis is that policy choices and punishment are independent of crime patterns and crime trends. Now, for myself, I think that's an empirical question. I think it varies from place to place. I think that actually in low crime societies, penal policy is much more autonomous. In high crime societies, not so much. In other words, the way in which we punish, the way in which penal policy develops in a low crime society might be relatively autonomous of what's going on in the world of crime and violence. I think, for example, of Finland. Finland had a quite high level of incarceration up until the 1970s. It then dramatically reduced its incarceration level to, you know, from 200 or 300 per 100,000 to 40 or 50 per 100,000. And it did that in order to, I don't know, become Nordic, to assimilate itself to the Norwegian and Denmark and Danish and Swedish practices and patterns of welfare punishment, welfare state, social democracy, and a punishment that accorded with that. But Finland never had a very high crime rate. And Finland was able to undertake these radical transformations of punishment without really, the government didn't really experience a kind of blowback in terms of public safety being jeopardized. Similarly, if you compare European Union countries, most of which have very low levels of crime compared with the USA or even compared with Australia, what you find is that there's no real correlation between their rates of crime or even their crime trends and the rates of punishment. Ergo, people like Michael Tonry often say, there's no relationship between how we punish and crime. Now, I think that that's not a principle or a theoretical statement that you can generalize. It's actually an empirical fact that varies from place to place. And I think that high crime societies, particularly the USA, the policymakers, politicians are not free to punish as they like. That there's really a big impact on their incentives and their room for maneuver and their opportunity structure if violent crime is becoming a problem for people in their daily lives. That translates pretty quickly into public opinion, pretty quickly into primary decisions in political parties and political party formation of policy. So I think it's a variable. Other people think it's kind of a theoretical issue. So, for example, Louis Foucault and Michel Alexander, both of them have written very influential books, very widely read, very greatly cited. Both of them claim there's a kind of crime-prison disconnect. That the buildup of penal laws, the development of increased rates of incarceration, the extensive use of punishment had nothing to do with crime rates and everything to do with reasserting racial order, or everything to do with managing a neoliberal economy, and nothing to do with crime. I think that that claim, though it's made frequently, although people, I think, prefer it ideologically in a way, because then you can point to political motivation for punishment that removes it from any kind of relationship to public safety or to crime, and therefore opens up more possibilities for blaming culprits and also for bringing about reform that will be costless in terms of public safety. I think that that kind of approach today has pretty much been invalidated. And I think it's been regarded now as untenable, particularly because some quantitative social scientists, people like Peter Enns at Cornell, have shown in great detail how crime rates and changes in crime rates, particularly violent crime, have directly produced changes in public opinion, and that these changes in public opinion are directly correlated with changes not in the rate of imprisonment, but changes in the rate of imprisonment. That's to say that the rate at which it's changing is geared to public opinion and geared to crime in a way that's really quite direct. So the notion that these things are autonomous one of the other, that these things are disconnected, I think has been shown quantitatively in a controlled way to not be true. Now, of course, crime rates, including violent crime rates, can increase steeply without causing any increase in punishment. That's precisely what happened in the USA between the 1960s and the 1980s. And the reverse can happen, that crime rates can go down without causing any consequence for imprisonment rates. That's what happened in the USA between 1995 and 2008. Basically, crime rates went down, imprisonment rates continued to go up. So the two things are not moving around in lockstep, to utilize an imprisonment term. However, there are time lags and there are mediations. And these mediations have to do with public opinion, policy formation, the enactment of policy, the practice and the implementation of sentencing changes, and the slow buildup of numbers of people in prison. Because of course, if you incarcerate numbers of people today for longer sentences, they're still there 10 years later, and they're contributing to the number of people in prison. The prison population is the kind of cumulative outcome of decisions made at very earlier points in time, sometimes much earlier points in time. So the crime punishment relationship is always time-lagged, is always mediated, is always a policy effect, not a mechanical, obvious effect. Nevertheless, it exists. And I don't think anyone can understand the drift towards mass incarceration in the USA or the shift to a much more extensive use of penal control in the USA unless they attend to the huge spike in homicides and violent crime that occurred from 65 onwards, and which only ceased and began to decline in 1995. These things are clearly, I think, related and need to be theorized in that way. Okay, I'm at an hour. I kind of hoped and promised I would finish. So here's the last thing I'll say, and it's to do with the orientation that scholars have towards either topics or towards theory. It's true, this is true in law and society generally, and Susan Silby and Austin Surratt made the point years ago, there's a great pool of the policy audience. Basically, the idea that the research you can do will be of interest to policymakers and might be relevant and might make a difference. That, I think, is a very powerful draw for scholars in this area. Practically, it always often the case to do with financing and research funding and access as well. So it's not a surprise, I think, if people move into the field because the topic is politically salient, mass incarceration, felon disenfranchisement, the death penalty, today penal fees and charges, private prisons. All of these things are policy relevant. All of these things have attracted a great deal of research. However, part of the point, I think the signature feature of the sociology of punishment is not just to understand punishment, it's also to understand society. And things that are policy relevant aren't always sociologically relevant. Things that might be interested for developing theory and understanding may not be the things that the topics of today's political concern lead you towards. A related problem, it seems to me, is that in some people in the USA say in the academy in general, but certainly in sociology of punishment, punishment society scholarship, there's very little ideological diversity. Most people who work in this field are progressive or left liberal in their political orientations to some degree or another. There are very few conservative voices, and to the extent that they exist, they usually keep quiet about controversial things. So, for example, mass incarceration, which has been massively popular and legislated in every state over 40 years, time and time again, never called that, but kind of accumulating and producing that, has no academic supporters. Basically, you can't find anyone in the academy who has a good thing to say about mass incarceration. Many people won't even say that it had any effect suppressing crime rates. Although how it could be that 2.4 million people are in prison every day and it's got no impact on criminal events outside escapes me. People don't want that to be true, don't want to suggest that one way of, as it were, curbing violence is to lock up millions of people forever. The fact that it nonetheless is true is something that people have trouble saying for that kind of to do with political, ideological consensus and constraint. Same with the death penalty, same with private prisons, same with commercialized corrections. These things have few supporters in the academy, despite the fact that policymakers and practitioners kind of love them. So for most scholars in the field, I think people who study punishment typically want less of it. And what it means is for scholars in this field, less intense sanctions are preferable to more intense ones, shorter sentences preferable to longer ones, discretionary sentences preferable to mandatory ones, non-custodial measures preferable to imprisonment, monetary penalties to correctional supervision, and so on. For the same reason, by and large, people in this field are keen on welfarist or restorative measures, but never on deterrative and retributive ones. Now, that's fine. And these ideological commitments pretty much explain why young academics take up this field, why there's an energy and a kind of an engagement and a commitment. And I'm sure that that will continue to be the case. I mean, punishment, I think, is a kind of tragic institution, There's very little to commend it other than it's necessary at times. And therefore, it's not surprising that people are critical of it and how it's undertaken. Nevertheless, it seems to me that from an intellectual point of view, there are reasons to hope that some scholars, some of the time, will ask questions which go against the grain of this conventional wisdom and which press contradictory viewpoints, even when they're politically unpopular. So, for example, we could perhaps avoid groupthink and ideological evasion if we ask questions that really just connect with what many people in the society think and what many policy makers are doing, right? So why don't societies use punishment more often than they do? That's a Nils Christie question. Are retributive sanctions necessary to sustain moral norms? That's a Durkheimian assumption. Do rituals of punishment have a positive social value? What value or what benefits do supporters of the death penalty actually derive from supporting the death penalty? Why do we assume that they're just racists and knaves and don't know what they're doing? Could we think that perhaps there's some reason that people have these views, people are motivated to vote that way, spend their tax dollars that way, support that kind of end? These kind of questions seem important to me, not so that we have a more representative academy that looks more like the population, but in order that we have a better intellectual grasp of the institutions that we're, I think, sometimes too quick to just reject as if they make no sense or as if they are unthinkable. It might actually improve our understanding and in the end, improve our normative and policy engagement with the institutions to try and think through why they're popular. Why people of goodwill, rational people, people who are spending their income on these things, support things that we regard as being insupportable. I think that intellectually that would be useful. I think that it's hard to bring that about precisely because the thing that attracts people towards this area is also the thing that limits and constrains it in that kind of way. So, to finish, a point I made right at the beginning, namely that over the last 30, 40 years, real world events have been one of the major explanations for why so many people have moved into this area and made that their scholarly undertaking. But I think these same real world events and these political reasons for engaging may in the end constrain us intellectually. And it might be important to kind of try and think outside of these political commitments to better understand what it is that we're dealing with. Thank you very much indeed. I'm finished. Yeah.
Thank you so much, David. That was provocative, especially towards the end. Thank you so much. We now have about 15 minutes for questions from the audience. So we will be running around and taking questions. I've certainly got a whole page of them as well.
Thank you so much, Professor. As always, all the rest of your work as well is super insightful. I studied political economy here at the university in undergrad, and they taught us in deference to your last point about considering why what is eschewed academically is so popular in practice. We think about in political economy, especially in the Marxist tradition, the entrepreneurialization of the individual and how that trend is increasing, the increasing marketization of our lives, and the internalization of neoliberal ideals as being the metric against which moral action is measured. And so we're thinking about, oh, the reason punitivity against minority people, for example, is popular is because, of course, why am I explaining this to you? You already know this, is because there is a moral extrapolation of value where value is now the constant pursuit. Can you tell me, because I don't really know that much about sociology, what is the explanation for public popularity for these kinds of things? Like, what's your replacement for the neoliberalization of the individual in your discipline?
So thanks very much for the question. So the reasons that people have for being condemnatory towards offenders, particularly violent offenders, and for assuming that somehow or other retributive, just deserts, and deterrence are appropriate ways of dealing with them, that doesn't require very much in the way of analysis. That by and large corresponds with, the exchange basis of social life, right? We understand tit for tat, exchange, you give, you get, as being the first thing infants learn when they're growing up. It's a basic. If there are any fundamental characteristics of human relations, exchange is one of them. And the notion that it might be appropriate to give back to the offender what the offender has given to his or her victim, that's a kind of a traditional standard way of thinking that has a robust common sense about it. And people often, they make the mistake of thinking about how other people behave in terms of how they themselves think and behave. And we think, well, I would be deterred by the prospect of being in prison, so therefore, why wouldn't you deter other people by doing the same thing? So there's a whole series of understandings about punishment that have no highfalutin technical, you've got to go to university to understand this character to them. They correspond to commonsensical views. And a lot of the time what, reforming correctional penologists want to do, or what critical sociologists want to say, flies in the face of that common sense, right? So to overcome that, you'd have to persuade people that individual actors, adults who engage in criminal behavior ought not to be punished, or that it won't work and be expensive and counterproductive. And so that's a big undertaking, and it's not one that policymakers and politicians are engaged in. It's one that academics kind of raise and present and sometimes succeed in arguing. But I mean, I'm struck recently by one of the things that leftists like myself, progressives, typically do in a situation. Say, well, okay, you're talking about that crime that just occurred, or that violent event, or that pattern of robbery in your neighborhood, and so let's look at root causes. And I think that's root causes, poverty or capitalism or white supremacy or something. I think that's sometimes like a demeaning changing of the subject. I don't want to talk about root causes. I want to talk about the crime that just occurred in my neighborhood, what you're going to do about it. You're certainly not going to reform capitalism tomorrow, and it's tomorrow I'm worried about, because this person will come back if we don't. So the way in which people think about crime and control of crime and policing is often too quick to move to fundamentals like the neoliberal ideologies that are out there, or the character of social relations that capitalism puts in place, or attitudes towards young black men produced by white supremacy. That these are real things. These are important background structures. These are a topic for mass movements to address and hopefully over time transform. But they're not going to solve your problem of crime on the streets. And I think that the difficulty of progressives thinking about and talking about crime often has to do with the kind of one-note nature of the analysis. And one has to think both in terms of the real harms and suffering typically experienced by poor people, people of color, people in disadvantaged neighborhoods that crime produces, and think about what kind of public safety you can provide to them before you begin to also think about the circumstances that produce neighborhoods like that, right? And so I don't think it's a surprise that many people are, have a knee-jerk sense that serious offenders ought to be punished and kept off the streets and away from my neighborhood. That's not difficult to understand. It doesn't require that we imagine that they've been hoodwinked by neoliberal ideology and they think in terms of monetary value and they shouldn't do that. I think that by and large, it's a given about crime and punishment. And to address it differently is a really big undertaking that needs to always be mindful of the immediacy of the situation as well as the larger ambition of reform.
Thank you. We've got some more. Murray. Oh, thanks.
Thanks, David. Thanks for lovely, provocative talk. I was interested. It felt like it came in a bit of a circle in the end. You started off with the big questions, came back to the as you say, the movement to sort of mid-range theorizing and things, but you seem like you landed back on the big questions at the end. Was just my sort of observation, and perhaps a wish for getting back to big theoretical questions. But that's not my question. My question actually relates to, and maybe this undermine your question, Carolyn, that you might have later, but thinking about a sort of related field that has emerged, and I think that have sort of provoked different theoretical questions around the sensory experiences of prisons, the sonic elements of prisons, the visual elements, the aesthetics, the architecture. People like Yvonne Duke's work on prison architecture, or Kate Harridy's work on sound in prisons, and which seem to open up different sorts of theoretical questions. They may not be the sociology of punishment at all. That's what maybe your response is, but I think they are still big theoretical questions, but they sit next to some of the stuff that you've talked about. I just wonder if you would speak to that.
So I agree that these are important questions. I agree that they are a major part of the sociology of punishment society scholarship. The great tradition of the sociology of imprisonment, the kind of work that I was describing, Clemmer and Sykes and Jacobs and Garland, that's really been stalled to some extent because access to prisons for scholars has really been curtailed in a serious way over time. We don't have people just doing what, I don't know, Gresham Sykes did, or Irving Goffman did, and moving into and becoming a staff member, or some part of the research apparatus of a prison and studying it. My friend Jim Jacobs, much lamented, recently deceased Jim Jacobs, he basically worked in a prison, Stateville, for a year at a time and interviewed the guards, the inmates, understood what was going on, got access to everything. That's much less available to people today. But I do think that the work that those scholars who've succeeded in getting access are doing is really very, very important. I mean, people in Alison Liebling and Ben Crew in Cambridge and in England, Sharon Dolovich in the USA, Yvonne Dukes. I mean, the kind of level of work they're doing is building on an already sophisticated understanding of how prison as a society works. How the pains of imprisonment are experienced, how they're deflected, what resiliency looks like. But often, and importantly, sometimes that work's undertaken in order to advance sociological understanding. So for example, famously, Gresham Sykes wrote the book, Society of Captives, at a time when people were worried about totalitarian power. And one of the things that book explained was that actually totalitarian power is a weak form of power. Because even when you give total power to the guards, when the regime has nothing but, there's no liberty, there's no rights, the guard have all the power, it's very difficult to implement that regime. First of all, carrying out these instructions are always costly, and there are cheaper ways of evading them, so staff evade them. Secondly, if inmates have no incentive to comply, then everything is tension, everything is conflict, everything is aggravation. So in the prison world, what happens is staff and inmates accommodate to each other and begin to kind of develop a kind of modus vivendi, which is not totalitarian, which on the contrary is constantly allowing back and forward and blind eyes and accommodations and so on. That kind of analysis is undertaken for sociological reasons, right? The Sykes was clearly making claims that were relevant to the sociology of his colleagues at Princeton, other people there. Most of the time today, people who are doing work in prisons are interested in making prisons better, making prisons less, making inmates less prone to suicide, making sure that there's less corruption amongst guards, making sure that the circumstances of family visits are less inhumane. And that's kind of important work, interesting work, and so on. And it takes an enormous amount of commitment and dedication to get to the level when you can make these claims, but they're often removed from these other issues that I'm describing as being using punishment to understand society. So, there's a big division of labor in the world, the academic world. Different people do different things. The way you evaluate these different things will vary. My sense of what's important is, not shared by many people in the policy world. So, yeah, that kind of the in-prison research and analysis is certainly part of sociology of punishment. The way it's undertaken can vary in terms of, is it topic-centered or theory-centered? And that to me is an interesting difference, but not one that I'd, legislate about.
We've only got time for one more question, actually. Oh, sorry. Which one was first? Sorry, I didn't see. Oh, and there's one. Oh, okay. I think we've only got time for a couple.
And also very quick answers, yes.
Hopefully so. Thank you for your work. So prison as we know it is barbaric, antiquated, violent and obsolete, ill-equipped to provide solutions to the people that it incarcerates. Where do you see innovation coming from?
So the prison as we know it is many different things in many different places. And the prison as Americans know it is all these things. It may be true in Australia as well. And imprisonment necessarily carries with it a whole series of deprivations and pains, but there's a huge variation between, I don't know, Norwegian prisons and prisons in New South Wales. So one of the currents that's very popular in the USA just now, particularly amongst progressives, particularly amongst my law students at NYU, is abolitionism, the idea that you'll abolish the prison one day. The prison actually has a lot of advantages as a form of penal institution. It's first of all, it's not utilizing violence, it's utilizing constraint and walls or kind of, physical corporal constraints in that kind of way, but it needn't be a place where people are subjected to inhumane practices any more than a public school. A boarding school needs to be a place where you're subjected to inhumane practices, or a submarine, or a hospital. Everything depends on the regime, the staff, the background politics that either encourage inhumanity and cheap and mean, demeaning prisons, or regard imprisonment as a way of testing the civilization of the nation that presents them. So Niels Christie, the wonderful Norwegian thinker, he used to say we should think about prisons in the way we think about, national opera houses. They should be a place that people take pride in because they're reflections of the national culture and the national achievement and what it is that Norwegians or Americans or Australians are able to provide. Now that seems like absurd to an American, but it didn't seem absurd in the late 18th century to people in Philadelphia whose prison buildings were the most prestigious public building they'd produced, and every visitor who came to Pennsylvania was led to them immediately to see how remarkable, how civilized, how progressive these buildings, these palaces were for the better treatment of inmates who'd previously been flogged and executed. So I do think that prisons, massively overused where I come from, are nonetheless a kind of unavoidable part of a modern day penal system. That part can be, Norwegian levels, 40 per 100,000, or American levels, 700 per 100,000. That is a variable. And the quality of life inside them, in terms of what it is that the staff imagine themselves to be doing, undertaking social work, provision, education, healthcare, or dealing with bad guys in a way that is just seriously repressive and never held accountable by the outside. These are variables within the prison as we know it. So I do think that the possibility for forms of imprisonment that are not the objectionable characteristics you're describing is there. Nobody will ever want to be incarcerated when they could be free. Nobody will want to be behind bars when they could be outside. but the question of the character and quality of prison is a real one. And I think that that's the kind of work, I mean, the person that mentioned, Murray mentioned Yvonne Jukes and the work on, wasn't Murray, on you know, the auditory qualities of a prison, or Alison Liebling on the suicide in a prison. That kind of work is all about moving away from one model to a better one. Sorry, I said I'd have shorter answers to your questions. I really failed. But it's a good question. Thanks.
So, David, you began your talk with the philosophy of punishment as one of these prehistorical themes in the research, alongside with the Penology. And then somehow it disappeared in your presentation, as if it were sort of eroded by later developments in the in scholarship. Well, and then in your response to the first question, you said, maybe at least I've heard you saying that retributivism is sort of thoughtless, instinctive response based on almost, yes, thoughtless responses to harm, while we need more reasoned and sensitive approaches in terms of reform, etc., or deterrence, etc. And I just would like to connect this response of yours to the issue of philosophy of punishment. So where is it now? Because there was a time when retributivism was defended on humanitarian rather than I don't know, vindictive grounds. I'm thinking of people like Herbert Morris and others, you know, all this talk about the rights to be punished and so on. Sure. So is it really the case that philosophy of punishment, as it had been developed, say, in 1960s and 70s, is now dead, that is no longer an issue? Or it should be revived to show that maybe there is no necessary correlation between philosophy of the goals of punishment in terms of retributivism, utilitarianism, etc., and the degree of, I don't know, harshness of punishment and vindictiveness, etc.
So thank you very much indeed for that question, Wojciech. So if you heard me say that, then I said it badly. The emergence of sociology of punishment as a framework occurred at a particular moment. Prior to that, there was already established two very robust frameworks for thinking about punishment: Penology, philosophy of punishment. Both of these frameworks continue to exist. Both of these frameworks continue to operate. More people are involved in Penology, and maybe more law students in philosophy of punishment than are involved in sociology of punishment. So they haven't gone away. They're not prehistorical in the sense of, you know, once upon a time, but not now. They simply were what existed prior to the emergence of this field. And where the philosophy of punishment is today, I would say that there's been a very interesting set of developments in philosophy of punishment. So the standard concerns about the nature of retribution, you're correct. Retribution shouldn't be confused with, as it were, punitiveness or harshness. It should be understood with as it were, a fair balancing of exchange, so that only a person who has actually committed a wrong deserves to be punished, and only to the extent that that wrongfulness has a particular weight, the punishment should have that too. So retribution could be understood as a restraint on punishment, limiting retribution rather than kind of a vengefulness that has no limit. I think, though, that the most interesting developments into philosophy of punishment have actually taken on a kind of sociological dimension, in a way, that the aspect of punishment that's about not just deserts or deterrence, but about communication, has, I think, been the most interesting and energetic area of philosophy of punishment since my friend Anthony Duff got going on this topic 20 years ago, following on Feinberg, following on Herbert Morris also. In other words, thinking about not what punishment does, you know, does it stop you in your tracks? Does it make you choose differently? But rather what punishment says and to whom it says it. So is punishment about communicating a value to the onlooking audience, the way Durkheim thinks? Durkheim basically assumed that punishment was a ritual of communication aimed at and connecting with an onlooking audience of right-minded citizens. He assumed that the person being punished was beyond help, that probably hadn't been socialized properly and probably wasn't listening. Some of the times that's true, but the work that Anthony Duff wants to do is to say, well, actually the only basis on which punishment is justified is when the person being punished is addressed as a rational person with agency and cognition, and you address that person in a way that gets his attention or her attention so that they can understand why this violence is being done to them, or this suffering is being imposed on, or even this condemnation without harm is being, and that is the only legitimate punishment, one that takes seriously the agency and the humanity of the person who's the recipient. But also at the same time, well, how do we communicate in punishment? You know, what does punishment say, not just what does it do? And that's an interesting sort of semiotic question, right? So how do I know what it means to say, I'm going to impose the death penalty? So in practice, it means that a person will be taken away in the USA and kept on death row for 15 to 25 years and then exonerated, or not exonerated, but shifted to life imprisonment without parole after 5 rounds of appeals and petitions. That's what it actually means. But maybe the statement, you know, I sentence you to death, has a whole bunch of other meanings for the onlookers, for the public, for the politicians, for the victim's family. Figuring out what punishments say is a very tricky undertaking. And you would need to, as it were, interview the audiences, have a kind of reader reception theory of semiotic exchange, and not just imagine, because I say this, you hear this, right? I said something, you heard it differently. Happens all the time. That's what meaning is. And that must be true even more so with punishment, because the audience for punishment is hostile and conflicted. The person in the dock for sure, the victim's family or the victims also, the onlookers with their different views, progressive views, reactionary views in between. It's a very interesting question. I think philosophy of punishment has moved more towards that in a way which is more reality congruent and more interesting than the work. I mean, when I showed a slide, I showed the slide of H.L. Hart's Punishment and Responsibility. It's one of the most sophisticated, attuned understandings of punishment, much, much better than most of the work that preceded it, but it's still framed by a kind of idealized version of what it is to punish. And I think that many philosophers have moved beyond that. Sociology of punishment just does something different, sometimes with normative content. I'd like a small plug for my own book on capital punishment. The book I wrote on capital punishment had the singular demerit, in the views of many reviewers, of not having any normative claims about capital punishment, good or bad. It basically tried to explain why it exists in these places, in these forms today. And some reviewers said, well, why doesn't Garland come out and tell us whether he's for it or against it? And my view was, by describing how this practice operates, you provide information about the death penalty. There's not a kind of an ideal notion, oh, we're going to kill a murderer, it's just going to happen. But it's going to be a story about some people get sentenced, most people don't, to death. Those people that do get sentenced typically are these kind of people from that kind of background. If they've got a lawyer, they won't get sentenced to death. If they get sentenced to death, that'll be 15 years later. If they get a good lawyer of these 15 years, they will be exonerated or moved into. So death penalty in the end is the lethal injection, which, by the way, is not euthanasia. Knowing all of that puts us on a different normative basis for evaluation. We don't say death penalty right or wrong. We say death penalty as practiced in a place with all of its pathologies and difficulties and all of its discriminations and targeting. Are you still in favor of it? That seems to me a better way of posing normative questions than just to say, are you for the death penalty or against it? So sociology of punishment, I think, is a contributor to the normative agenda while not really being part of the philosophy of punishment. That would be the claim.
Thank you very much. We are actually well over time. I know that there was another question, and I'm just wondering if I can invite you to come down. We really don't have time, unfortunately. Would you like to come and ask a question directly to David Garland? I'm really sorry about that. Please join me in thanking David Garland for the presentation.